It is my great pleasure to bring to the stage the most amazing channel in the world, Daryl Anka. So I would just like to say, please join me in thanking Daryl and Bashar for bringing through this amazing information and sharing with us this new perspective on our interdimensional and extraterrestrial relationships from now until the past and then into the future. Thank you, Daryl and Bashar.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being here tonight. I'm just going to go right into it. So please have a good time, and I'll see you later. Maybe. Oh, it'll say good day to you this day of your time. How are you all? All right? Thank you. Once again, we thank you for the co-creation of this interaction, the allowance of this transmission. This day of your time, we have entitled this transmission the Interstellar Enneagram. Enneagram generally being a word in your language that represents the number 9. But this is not arranged exactly in the way that many of you are familiar with the enneagrams that you use on your planet. This is really just a matrix of 9 squares in a square, 3 rows of 3. And they are, each box, representative of what we have talked about before, generally speaking, a permission slip, visual representation of different frequencies of energy that are representative of different civilizations. In essence, you could say, like a phone number for that particular dimensional realm, that particular civilization. A frequency that if you focus on it, meditate on it, look at it, get in alignment with that visual that is representative of that energy stream, that domain of consciousness, will aid and assist you in connecting more readily as a permission slip to that particular frequency of reality and make it a little bit easier for you to connect and align with and receive information from the representative domains that exist within this particular 9-box matrix or enneagram. Now, as you can see, there are 9 colored boxes in the center of this diagram, generally representing on the bottom row the idea of the ancient Orion systems, the Anunnaki energy, the Grey Federation, and in the middle row, left to right, the idea of our civilization of Essassani, or in our upgraded state, Shakani. The middle box is representative of you, Earth. The idea on the right-hand side will be the representational symbol for the Yael, or in our ancient language, the Shalanaya. On the top row, you will see the representation of the diagram, the symbol for the vibration of the Sirius star system. In the center, the Arcturus vibration. And on the right, the Pleiadian systems. Now, you will also notice that there are some open boxes around the edges that contain different words. Now, for those of you who may be joining us in zero gravity with no particular orientation, the word hypersapien should be at the top, just in case you were wondering. We will get to describing exactly what those mean in another part of this transmission, but for now, again, the labeling of the box, the open box at the bottom, underneath the matrix of 9 says proto-sapien. At the top it says hypersapien. To the left it says reptilian. And to the right it is the new hybrids. Now that you have this basic diagram, this basic enneagram, we will now take you through a little bit of the vibrational history and relationship of each, one at a time on the bottom row, to your world and how you share their vibration, how you share their history, what is relevant for you to understand at this time. Tomorrow of your time in that transmission, we will deal with the middle row, and on your Sunday transmission, we will deal with the top row, and also the open boxes that surround them, to give you a more complete picture of the vibrational relationships that you have ongoing on a variety of levels with these civilizations and dimensions of consciousness. So, let us begin. We will actually, on the bottom row, begin in the center with the symbol for the Anunnaki, which is represented by a winged circle that contains the colors of gold and red and blue against a black backdrop. Now, you will notice, of course, first of all, that the wings are not contained within the box. We wanted to represent the entire symbol to you. And so, because the diagrams for Orion and the Great Federation to the left and the right were relatively simple 3-bar symbols, we simply allowed the wings to overlap each, understanding that this is an overlap. The wings are not part of the left and right diagrams. They simply rest on top for convenience of visualization. Now, the idea of the Anunnaki symbol, representative of this golden flying disc, that has at its heart a red dot which represents the life within, and around the gold disc the idea of a blue energy field. This is actually to some degree representative of the ancient ships that used to visit your planet from the Anunnaki, and is representative of the symbols that you still see in many of the cultures on your planet, the flying disc. Represented in many different ways, of course. Not a literal representation of their ships, but close enough, in the sense that the ships were basically disc-like in the center and did possess a certain type of wings and steering mechanisms as they glided through your atmosphere, even though they didn't necessarily require them. In space, they were capable of retracting and folding in a way that allowed the ships to be more streamlined when these appendages were unnecessary in the vacuum of space. But once they entered your atmosphere, they did look like flying discs in a variety of ways. So they could steer through your atmosphere and use the gravitational fields by extending these wings to guide them and land them safely upon your planet. As many of you already understand, the Anunnaki are the extraterrestrial civilization generally responsible for the alteration of your genetic structure from what you would call the natural hominid that existed on your planet, called Homo erectus, to the idea of now what you call yourselves to be Homo sapien. In altering the genetic structure by including some of the Anunnaki DNA, they allowed you to create or exist in its present form, the human being, as you call yourselves, so that they would have a relationship to the Anunnaki, to be utilized in a variety of ways in that relationship, as workers, as companions, in a variety of ways, for their purposes of visiting your world, which fundamentally was to aid and assist them in mining minerals, gold in particular, that would allow them to alter the weather patterns of their own planet and make adjustments in that way to their energy fields. Now, the group of Anunnaki that actually visited your world, that was originally consigned to find those minerals and bring them back to the home world, were actually, to begin with, assigned to simply do this task themselves. Eventually, they found that this was something that was relatively difficult for them to do on their own, and so they believed they needed what you would call a workforce in order to aid and assist them. And knowing that there was a natural indigenous being upon the planet that was similar in form to them, they understood that they could genetically alter it to aid and assist them in this way by upgrading it, so to speak, to something more similar to their own form, and thus, by creating that force, allow that force to work in the mines to extract the gold and other minerals that they require, eventually also developing a long-term relationship with them in a variety of ways, even to the point of companionship many, many years after that. Now, this began somewhere around 500,000 of your years ago in the general areas that you call the Middle East and the African continent. And those branches of the hominid species that were not altered genetically by the Anunnaki evolved on their own in parallel to the human beings on your planet that the Anunnaki had created. And those that were not altered eventually evolved into the form you now call Sasquatch. So the idea is that if you had not been altered at all, today you would all be Sasquatch. But because you were altered, because you were evolved in that way, you became human beings. This also allowed for certain kinds of incarnational experiences to happen that would be very different than the incarnational experiences of Sasquatch, or Yeti, or Bigfoot, or whatever you wish to call that branch of your cousins. Now, they evolved in a very natural way, which allowed them to have a much closer connection in many ways to the idea of nature, and allowed them to develop abilities and skills that you do contain, but in a sense have forgotten that you have because of the alteration. Their abilities and skills as Sasquatch allow them to actually enter interdimensional states, passing from parallel reality to parallel reality, different dimensions to different dimensions, which is why they are so difficult to find on your planet when they don't want to be found. Nevertheless, getting back to your story, the branch that you became, eventually there were also interminglings between some of the humans of the time and the Anunnaki on the world, and these created births, natural births of beings that you have in your legends come to call the so-called demigods and so forth. Now, the Anunnaki were much taller in general than you are, and some of the earlier races on your planet of humanity were also much taller than most of you, although you are regaining not only your height again, but also your longevity, because in times past, a lot of the genes were passed along to the human beings that were genetically created that allowed them to live for hundreds of years, because the Anunnaki lived for thousands of years. The idea is that you are regaining this ability again. The genetic material is being opened up again because of new vibrations that are now existing in this present day on your planet, allowing you more longevity, allowing you greater height, greater health, greater vitality. And you are opening up those connections energetically to the Anunnaki and those genetic materials that you contain. Now, of course, the Anunnaki themselves also contained a mixture of different genetics from different races. We will not get into that so much right now, although you can certainly understand, we will give you a little bit of a sneak preview, that one of these was what is called on that diagram the Proto-Sapiens. We will get into them another time. But you could say that in general, the Proto-Sapiens are the precursors of all the human forms in your galaxy. Now, the Anunnaki, the branch that was on your planet, and creating the idea of the Homo sapien groupings, were actually just a branch. And in their original assignment, were not really supposed to tinker with the genetics of the planet. When the main council of Anunnaki discovered that they had done so and created a new intelligent race of beings, well, let's just say they weren't very happy about it. They actually recalled that Anunnaki contingent from the Earth, and in many ways left you to your own devices, allowing you to grow on your own, to evolve on your own, with some degree of guidance from them, because they felt responsible in allowing that contingent of Anunnaki to create you. They felt responsible to guide you to some degree, although it was not the original plan. And so again, the stories of visitations over time, again from the idea of angels and gods from the sky, leading and guiding and teaching in a variety of ways to allow you to grow into your own civilization and allow you to take over some of the cities that had been created and become the actual kings of old, although the Anunnaki bloodline still coursed strongly in their veins. You see this in the representation of the ancient 10 kings of Atlantis, in Lemurian times, and even into relative modern times, as you still remember Egypt as having kings, and then eventually the idea of pharaohs. But all this goes back to the concept of the blue bloods, the royal lines, and everything that created the concept of royalty on your planet, because it is traced all the way back to the idea of the Anunnaki, who actually were slightly bluishly tinged. So the blue blood line was looked upon as the purest line in that way, although of course you all contain Anunnaki genetics. But there might be here and there some that are more directly related in direct lineages to some of those ancient genes. Now, once that began to happen, and you had on your planet contingents of humans who were creating their own civilizations, mostly guiding themselves with a little bit of input here and there from extraterrestrial beings and extra-dimensional beings, teaching them how to open up their consciousness to tap into source, to draw down and download information from a variety of sources, then eventually humanity was pretty much left on its own in that way to evolve to a certain point to see if they would arrive at a point where they could then reconnect with the idea of extraterrestrial beings, extra-dimensional beings, which would show that they evolved to a point where the next stage of evolution could occur. We will leave that story for the moment and shift over to the idea of the ancient Orion systems and how they come into play in your reality. This story begins also long ago, in fact, actually millions of your years ago, in the ancient systems of Orion. There was, in that system, a society under great suppression, great oppression, great negativity, great hardship, great difficulty. In particular, on one of the worlds of the Orion systems that in the ancient language was called Huva. Huva, in that sense, was the central seat of the Orion government, which again was very oppressive. You can see the representation of the idea, the symbol of the vibration, of transformation that over time took place in the Orion systems by looking at the 3-bar banner on the lower left that is represented at the bottom by a black bar, in the middle by a red bar, and at the top by a white bar, showing that the transformation from negative to positive has occurred in the Orion systems, but it occurred through the middle bar of red, through the experiences of life, through the pain and difficulty and suffering of the beings in that time, through the blood of the people. Now, this story of the Orion systems took a long time to work itself through. There were resistances, what you would call underground movements, in the Orion systems, fighting against the suppression, fighting against the oppression, fighting against the negativity. The translation of those resistance fighters in your language would be the Black League. The Black League took their name as the idea of being invisible, being in the dark, being hidden, being surreptitious, so they could fight the fight they believed they had to fight against the oppressive governments of the ancient Orion systems. However, one of the very great lessons they learned in that time was the idea that if you fight fire with fire, you just get more fire. And the idea of using the same violent tactics against the government that the government was using against them did not really work out very well for that resistance movement, and it created an increase in the suppression and an increase in the negativity, and thus they learned that there must be another way. And in learning that there must be another way, they began to approach the idea of the negativity with positive energy, positive vibrations, and over time slowly transform the Orion systems from darkness into light, from negative into positive, through their sacrifice, through their pain, through their blood. But the idea is that many of the ancient Orions also made a connection to the idea of wanting to work this out on many different levels interdimensionally, and so created for themselves incarnational connections to other star systems that had the vibrational energy that would allow them to go through a process of transmuting this negative energy into positive energy. One of those systems was your solar system. Now, this again was millions of your years ago. But some of the first incarnations of ancient Orion energy occurred on a planet that is now what you call your asteroid belt. It no longer exists as a planet. And it was known by many names, but we will choose the idea of Maldek to represent it. Many incarnations were played out there. Much of the ancient Orion negativity was played out there, and eventually the vibration of that negativity was too much to handle and created circumstances and situations that ultimately destroyed the planet through collisions with other planetary bodies in the system when it was young. The incarnations then moved to the next habitable planet, which you now call Mars. At the time it was inhabited. Again, the ancient Orion systems worked themselves out to some degree, but there was still a lot of negativity to be worked out, as this process took eons and eons to go through. When Mars also attracted to itself the idea of a negative experience of destruction through the bombardment of asteroids that ripped away its atmosphere and turned it into the relatively desolate planet that you now understand Mars to be, then the incarnation shifted about 6,000 of your years ago to the Earth plane. Now, this does not mean that the destruction that took place on Mars happened 6,000 years ago. There was a lot of interim time in which, in other dimensions, the Orion energy was playing itself out and going through different processes until it was ready to come into the Earth vibration. The idea of the introduction of the ancient Orion energies and that process of going from the negative to the positive began to play itself out upon its arrival in the area on your planet you call the Middle East. And in this way it introduced a lot of that ancient negative energy that has still to play itself out on your planet, although it is transforming in this day and age. But as you can see by the banner of the Orion ancient systems, of the red and the black and the white, you will see this throughout your history in oppressive societies, especially what you would call the Nazis. In that was their colors as well. So you will recognize that this ancient negative Orion energy is playing itself out in a variety of ways through many of the things that are going on now on your planet with respect to terrorism, with respect to warfare, with respect to all these kinds of energies that are now getting themselves out on the table, out in front of all your faces, so you can finally decide if you are truly done with this process and transmute all this negativity in a positive way into light, without the idea of having to go through the suffering, the strife, the struggle, and the pain, and the shedding of the blood that is represented by the red band in this system. You have arrived now at this point, and in recent times, where the vibrational energy allowed you to be ripe, shall we say, to interconnect with what we are loosely calling the Gray Federation, which is represented by the banner on the lower right, in the three stripes of black, gray, and white. Now, as we have told the story, in general, the gray beings are a number of different things. They are an amalgamation, a federation of a number of different things. They are not really all lumped into one thing, although there are connections, which is why we are utilizing the term federation, to represent the connections between the different factions of beings that you might recognize in general as grays, and all the different varieties in which they come. However, do understand that, as we have already laid out for you, the grays are not really alien beings. Most of them, the ones that you are dealing with on your planet, are a race of mutated humans from a parallel Earth that destroyed itself. Once they had created a very high level of technology on that parallel version of Earth, much, much higher, much far beyond where your technology is now. But because they were so focused on the idea of technology and intellectuality, eventually they sacrificed the concepts of emotionality and looked upon this as an inferior state of being. They began to become very disconnected from nature, began to focus on these ideas in a variety of ways that allowed them to let their planet, in a sense, go to seed. They no longer really took care of the nature. They allowed themselves to strip mine, allowed themselves to deforest, allowed themselves to change the climate in such a way, all in the name of their technology, so that they ultimately looked up and realized that their planet was fast becoming uninhabitable to such a degree that even their technology could now no longer really do anything about it. And at this point, they had also taken themselves so far, altered themselves in such drastic ways in terms of their genetics, their technology, their biology, that they really were almost part human and part machine, and thus could no longer relate to the idea of nature in a variety of ways, but realized that what they had done was going to create a situation where their race would completely eventually die out. They no longer had the ability to reproduce. And so they realized that in order to perpetuate their species, they began experimenting with a number of things. First, because their environment was becoming less and less and less habitable, they moved themselves into underground cities. And in those underground cities, they experimented with their genetics and began to clone themselves over and over and over again, eventually, of course, realizing that this was a dead end. They, even with their technology, could not replicate the original human DNA. They knew they needed viable, vibrant, natural, original human DNA to introduce it back into their genetic structure if they were going to have any chance at all of perpetuating their culture. And so they realized that the only way to extract that would be to use their technology to tunnel into parallel realities where they knew humans must still exist, such as yours, and find the DNA that they require to create a hybrid race, one civilization of which we are, to allow their culture to perpetuate itself. So this they did, and created many different hybrid civilizations, which we will get into again tomorrow of your time. Nevertheless, in expanding into parallel realities as these mutated humans you now call the Greys, they eventually created a variety of different versions of themselves and also encountered in those parallel realities different varieties and different versions of themselves, including one that was actually native to the star system you recognize as Zeta Reticuli. By making, in a sense, a relationship with the beings there, they created something, they formed a relationship and an agreement with something that they desperately needed, which was a different kind of guidance, on a different kind of level, beyond just intellectuality, on a level that could see into different dimensions, could really help them plan out the idea of how to create these hybrid civilizations, who could oversee such a vast project that would take eons of time to manifest. Once they encountered these beings in the Zeta Reticuli system, they formed and developed a relationship with them to allow them to become the overseers of all of this plan, all of this agenda. And in allowing those overseers to participate in that hybridization agenda that would perpetuate their species, in some ways, they actually started deferring to them and allowed them to really become the primary organizers of their civilization. These overseers are what many of you in the abduction phenomenology have come to recognize as the insect-like mantis beings that are very tall. They became part, in that sense, of the Grey Federation as the overseers. Now, upon recognizing that many of the parallel reality versions of Earth that the Greys had tunneled into were also going down similar vibrational paths to the path they had taken that destroyed their world and prevented them from being able to reproduce, prevented them from having emotionality, they recognized that by creating these hybrid beings such as ourselves, they could also give back a gift to those parallel worlds by allowing these hybrid beings to stave off the same fate, the same experience that many of the parallel versions of Earth were also going down, so that they would not have to experience the same degree of limitation that the Greys experienced on their world. And so this is one of the reasons why we are sharing information with you this day of your time, and for the past 30 years, and in a variety of ways, to allow you to understand that you don't have to take the same negative path, that you can change your destiny, that you can awaken to your understanding of consciousness in such a way that you can create a reality for yourself that is quite different than the reality path that they took. Does all this make some sense to you? Yes. All right. This will be the history for now that we will share of the bottom row of the Enneagram. And as we, in the forthcoming transmissions this weekend of your time, include the other levels, we will also magnify and enhance what we have already said here as it relates to the idea of the Earth. Notice that in the center, the symbol, the vibrational telephone number, if you will, of your planet starts with a black square. Then there is a square within that that is tilted 45 degrees, that is blue. Then a square within that that is, again, straight, that is green. And then a square within that that is smaller, again, tilted 45 degrees, that is white. This, of course, represents the space around your planet. The blue is the water. The green is the land. The white is the air, the atmosphere, and the clouds of your world. The square represents what you typically refer to as the four corners of your world, and it allows you the opportunity to connect to these other diagrams, these other symbols in the Enneagram in a way where you can draw upon their energy, draw upon their information in the way that serves you best, in the way that is representative of the transformations you're making in your life at this time. And again, by focusing on these vibrational symbols as telephone numbers and linking and connecting and aligning with the vibrations of their particular dimensions, you can take advantage of downloading information and energy to yourself that will aid and assist you in centering your being in such a way that you can use all of this, use all these frequencies, use all these dimensions, use all these genetic connections, use all these relationships to guide yourself unerringly, straight and true, like a compass needle, to your best destiny. We will continue with this Enneagram transmission and expand upon this history in tomorrow's transmission. But for now, in return for the gift you are giving us and allowing us to experience you at this time and share with you in a family way, I ask, in what way may we now be of service to you with your questions?